A group of white men in robes rode into a black town at night. Torches lit, guns ready, faces covered. They weren't hiding. They wanted to be seen. That was the whole point. Fear, control, a message. This is what usually happened. But not that night. Because as they crossed into the edge of town, something moved in the dark. Not one person, not two. Dozens. Black men stepped out from the trees, silent, organized, armed, not running, waiting. And for the first time in their lives, the men in those white robes stopped. No shouting, no speeches, no warning, just a moment where both sides stood still. And then something nobody talks about happened. The Klan turned around and left. No fire, no attack, no terror. They rode out the same way they came in, except now they were the ones being watched. That story isn't famous. You won't find it in most textbooks, but it happened more than once. And once you understand who those men were and what they were willing to do, you start to realize something most people have never been told. The Ku Klux Klan didn't just spread terror. At certain points in American history, they were terrified too. And the people who made them feel that way were black men who refused to stay afraid. This is the part of history that gets skipped because it doesn't fit the narrative most people are used to. You've heard the story before. The Klan rises, violence spreads, black communities suffer, and that's true. But it's not the whole picture, because there were places where the Klan showed up expecting submission and walked into resistance instead. Organized resistance, armed resistance, relentless resistance. And when that happened, the power dynamic changed instantly because the Klan relied on one thing more than anything else: fear. If people were afraid, they controlled the situation. If people weren't, everything fell apart. And there were groups of black men who understood that completely. They weren't waiting for protection. They weren't hoping the system would save them. They already knew it wouldn't. So they built their own, quietly, carefully, sometimes in plain sight, sometimes completely hidden, but always ready. And once they started pushing back, the Klan started making mistakes, showing up where they shouldn't, targeting the wrong communities, thinking they had control when they didn't. And when those moments happened, the stories didn't spread because nobody wanted them to. Not the newspapers, not the politicians, not even some of the people involved. Because if that story gets out, if people realize that the Klan could be stopped, that they weren't untouchable, that changes everything. So instead, those moments stayed local, passed down quietly, never turned into national headlines, but they happened over and over again across different states, different decades, different groups of men who all came to the same conclusion. If fear's the weapon, then you take it away. And once you do that, the entire system breaks. Now here's where it gets serious. Because these weren't random acts. These weren't spontaneous reactions. This was strategy, deliberate, planned, sometimes coordinated across entire communities, and men taking turns standing watch at night, men training each other, men preparing for the moment when the Klan would show up because they knew it eventually would. And when it did, they were ready, not to run, to respond. And that's when something unexpected happened. The Klan started avoiding certain places. Think about that. An organization built on intimidation started picking targets more carefully, started skipping towns, started backing off when they heard certain names because they knew some communities weren't defenseless. Some communities would fight back. And fighting back came with a cost, a real one. Because standing up like that meant risking everything. Your life, your family, your home. There was no protection, no backup, no guarantee you survive it. And they did it anyway. That's the part that matters. Because it completely changes how you see this period of history. This wasn't just a story of violence being done to people. It was also a story of people refusing to accept it, of drawing a line and holding it, no matter what showed up on the other side. But here's the question nobody asks. Who were these men? Where did they come from? And how did they organize in a way that made one of the most feared groups in American history back down? Because the answer to that question is even more powerful than the story itself. Let's stop speaking in general terms. Let's talk about a moment. Bogalusa, Louisiana, KKK stronghold. This wasn't a place where you challenged them. This was a place where people disappeared, where intimidation wasn't occasional. It was constant. Civil rights workers came into town anyway, organizing, registering black voters, holding meetings. And immediately, the Klan responded the way they always did. Night rides, gunfire, threats, homes being targeted. They expected the same outcome they always got. Fear, silence, submission. But Bogalusa wasn't normal because the deacons for defense were already there, watching, waiting. And when the Klan made their move, something happened they didn't expect. They got shot at, not wildly, not recklessly, directly, accurately, from men who knew exactly what they were doing. There are reports, documented, that Klansmen opened fire and immediately received return fire. Precise, controlled, enough to make one thing clear. This was not a one-sided situation anymore. And just like that, everything changed. Because the Klan had built its entire reputation on dominance, on the idea that nobody would push back, that once they showed up, they controlled the night. But now they were stepping into situations where they could lose, where they could get hurt, where they could die. That wasn't part of the plan. And once that possibility became real, the behavior shifted fast. The same men who rode in confidently started moving differently, more cautious, more hesitant, more selective about where they showed up, because they didn't know what was waiting for them anymore. That uncertainty was everything, and it didn't stay contained to one town. Word spread quietly, but effectively. Stories of armed black men defending communities. Stories of the Klan backing off. Stories of resistance that actually worked. And once people heard that, something changed internally, because fear isn't just about what's happening. It's about what you believe is possible. And now a new possibility existed. You could stand your ground and survive it. That idea spread faster than any speech, faster than any headline, because it was proof, not theory. Now let's be clear about something. This wasn't chaos. This wasn't people just picking up weapons and reacting emotionally. This was controlled, strategic, measured. The deacons understood exactly what they were dealing with. They knew law enforcement couldn't be trusted. In many cases, police were either ignoring the Klan or working with them, so protection had to come from somewhere else. And they filled that gap, not because they wanted to, because they had to. And that's what made them effective. They weren't trying to prove a point. They were trying to survive. That difference matters because survival forces clarity, no ego, no unnecessary risk, just action when it's needed. And that's exactly what they did. Now, here's where it gets even more serious, because the federal government noticed not the violence, the balance, because suddenly you had a situation where the Klan couldn't operate freely and civil rights workers could actually function. Meetings could happen. Organizing could continue. Momentum could build. All because someone was making sure the cost of attacking was too high. That's not a small detail. That's a turning point, because without that protection, a lot of those efforts would have been shut down immediately. And that forces a question most people don't ask. How much of the civil rights movement survived because there were men willing to defend it with force if necessary? That's not something you hear often, but it's real. Now go back to Bogalusa. After those confrontations, after the Klan realized they weren't in full control, the city changed, not overnight, but noticeably. The attacks didn't stop completely, but they slowed. They became less aggressive, more cautious, because now there was risk. And once risk enters the equation, even the most aggressive groups start recalculating. That's exactly what happened. The Klan didn't disappear, but they stopped acting like they were untouchable. And that shift, that's power, not complete control, but enough to change behavior, enough to create space, enough to allow something else to grow. And that something else was progress, real progress, the kind that only happens when people are able to operate without constant threat of violence. Now, think about what that means. The image most people have is one of total dominance on one side and total vulnerability on the other. But that's not the full picture, because in places like Bogalusa, that dynamic broke, not through speeches, not through negotiation, through resistance, organized, disciplined, effective. And once it broke in one place, it proved it could break in others. That's the part that should stick with you, because it changes the entire framework. This wasn't just about surviving oppression. It was about confronting it directly and forcing it to adjust. But Bogalusa wasn't the only place this happened, not even close. Here's the part people don't talk about. The Klan didn't just fear guns. They feared being exposed, because their power didn't come from strength alone. It came from mystery, from anonymity, from the idea that they could show up, do what they wanted, and disappear. No names, no consequences, no faces. That illusion mattered. Take it away, and everything starts to crack. And in some places, Black communities figured that out. They realized something simple. If you can't stop them from coming, you can make sure they don't leave invisible. So they started watching differently, tracking movements, recognizing patterns, identifying people. Because here's the truth nobody says out loud. A lot of those men in robes weren't strangers. They were local, business owners, police officers, neighbors, men who lived normal lives during the day and put on hoods at night. And once that became known, everything shifted. Because now it wasn't just the Klan. It was specific people with names, with reputations, with something to lose. That's when things started getting dangerous for them. Not just physically, socially, because exposure breaks fear. And in certain towns, that's exactly what started happening. There are documented cases of Black communities quietly identifying Klansmen and spreading that information internally. No big announcements, no public confrontations, just knowledge. And knowledge changes behavior, because now those men had to think twice, not just about being confronted at night, but about being recognized during the day, seen in public, connected to what they were doing. That kind of pressure hits differently. It follows you. And for an organization built on secrecy, That's a problem. Now, combine that with something else, armed resistance, because individually, those things are powerful. Together, they're disruptive. Now you're dealing with a situation where you might get shot at and you might get exposed. That combination creates hesitation, and hesitation kills momentum. The Klan relied on momentum, on quick action, on overwhelming presence. Once that slowed down, their effectiveness dropped, and people noticed because suddenly there were places where they didn't show up anymore. Think about that. Entire areas where the Klan just stopped. No rides, no attacks, nothing. Not because they changed, but because the conditions changed. Because those communities made it clear, you can come here, but it's going to cost you. That's power. Not perfect safety, but enough control to change outcomes. Now let's go deeper, because this didn't just affect the Klan. It affected how black communities saw themselves. For generations, the expectation had been survival, endurance, getting through it. But now there was another option, resistance, and not just symbolic resistance, effective resistance, the kind that actually changes behavior. That shift matters because once people realize they're not completely powerless, everything changes. The way you move, the way you think, the way you respond. And that internal shift is just as important as anything happening externally because fear doesn't just control actions, it controls perception. Remove it or even reduce it. And people start operating differently, more confidently, more deliberately, more willing to take risks. And once that starts happening at scale, it becomes harder to contain. That's what was happening quietly under the surface. While the public narrative focused on one version of the movement, another version was unfolding at the same time. Less visible, less discussed, but just as real. Now here's where it gets uncomfortable again, because this kind of resistance didn't always get support. Even within the movement, some leaders believed it complicated things, that it could escalate violence, that it could be used as justification for more repression. And those concerns weren't wrong. There was risk, real risk, but there was also a reality that couldn't be ignored. Without protection, a lot of people wouldn't have made it. That's the tension. That's the part history struggles to present clearly because it's not clean. It's not one strategy or the other. It's both operating at the same time. Yet for different reasons in different ways, but with the same goal, survival, dignity, control. Now zoom out for a second, because when you look at the bigger picture, you start to see a pattern. Every time the Klan ran into organized resistance, they adjusted. Every time they faced communities that refused to be passive, they became more cautious, more selective, less aggressive, not gone, but changed. And that change mattered because it created space. Space for organizing, space for movement, space for progress. And that space didn't come for free. It was created deliberately by men who understood exactly what they were up against and decided not to accept it. But here's the part most people still don't realize. The Deacons, Bogalusa, these towns, they weren't isolated. There were other places, other moments, other groups, some even more direct, more confrontational, more visible. And in one of those places, well, the Klan didn't just hesitate, they got humiliated publicly in front of everyone. Here's something you need to understand. The Klan didn't just lose fights, they lost their image. And once that happened, they were never the same again because their power wasn't just violence, it was perception. They needed people to believe they were unstoppable, that once they showed up, it was over. That belief did half the work for them, but once stories started spreading, real stories of them getting pushed back, getting exposed, getting challenged, that belief started to crack. And once it cracks, it doesn't come back the same. Let's go straight to it. There were towns where Klansmen showed up expecting control and left embarrassed, not quietly, not hidden. Embarrassed in front of the very people they were trying to intimidate. That matters, because humiliation hits differently than fear. Fear can be hidden. Humiliation spreads, it sticks, and it travels. Now imagine this. You're part of an organization built on dominance. Your entire identity is based on control. And suddenly, you're in situations where people are standing their ground, looking you in the eye, not running, not backing down, and sometimes forcing you to leave. What does that do to your reputation? It destroys it. Slowly at first, then faster, because word spreads, not through newspapers, not through official channels, through people, through conversations, through stories passed from one town to another. They showed up here and got pushed back. They tried that in this area and it didn't work. They don't go there anymore. That kind of information is powerful because it changes expectations. Now, the Klan isn't entering every situation with automatic authority. Now they're entering with uncertainty, and uncertainty weakens everything. Now here's where it gets even more important. This wasn't just about confrontation. It was about control of space. Certain neighborhoods, certain towns, certain areas where the message became clear. This is not easy territory. And once that message sticks, behavior changes, even if it's not publicly acknowledged. Even if nobody says it out loud, people know. And the Klan knew. There were places they avoided, places they hesitated to enter, places where they weren't in charge anymore. That's a massive shift because control is what they depended on. Take that away, and they're just another group. Now think about what that means for the people living in those communities. For the first time, there were spaces where the balance felt different. Not perfect, not completely safe, but different. And that difference matters because it gives people room to breathe, room to organize, room to exist without constant pressure. And that's how movements grow. Not just through big moments, but through small pockets of stability, created intentionally, protected deliberately. Now here's the part that should really stick with you. None of this was handed to them. There was no outside force stepping in to make this happen. No sudden change in policy, no immediate shift in law enforcement. This came from within the communities themselves, from people deciding we're not accepting this anymore, and then backing that decision up with action, consistent action, disciplined action. That's what made the difference, because one moment doesn't change anything, but repeated moments, that creates a pattern, and patterns change reality. Now here's something else people don't talk about. This resistance didn't just affect the Klan. It affected how future generations understood power. Because when stories like this get passed down, even quietly, they reshape expectations. They challenge the idea that oppression is always one directional, that there's no room to push back, that there's no agency. And once that idea is challenged, it opens something up. Confidence, awareness, possibility. That matters long term, more than any single confrontation, because it changes mindset. Now let's be clear. None of this erased what the Klan did. None of this cancels out the violence, the fear, the damage. That's all real. But this adds something to the story, something that was always there, but rarely highlighted. Resistance that worked. Not perfectly, not everywhere, but enough to matter. Enough to shift outcomes, enough to leave an impact. And that impact didn't just disappear. It carried forward in different forms, in different movements, in different moments. Because once people understand that organized resistance can change behavior, they don't forget it, even if the stories aren't widely told. Now ask yourself this: if this history was more visible, if more people understood that the Klan could be pushed back, that they weren't always in control, how would that change the way people see that era? How would it change the narrative? Because right now, most people only see one side. They see what happened to black communities. They don't always see what black communities did in response. And that imbalance shapes everything. But once you add this in, the picture becomes more complete, more real, more powerful, because it shows something fundamental. Power isn't always fixed. It can be challenged, shifted, disrupted, but only when people decide to do it. And that's exactly what happened over and over again, in ways that didn't always make headlines, but mattered anyway. And here's the final piece. The Klan didn't disappear because of one thing. It wasn't just laws. It wasn't just protests. It wasn't just exposure. It was pressure from multiple directions at the same time. Legal pressure, social pressure, and in some cases, direct resistance, all of it working together, breaking down something that once felt untouchable. And that's the real story. Not just what the Klan did, but what happened when people refused to accept it. Let's be honest. If this history is real, if black communities pushed back, if the Klan was forced to retreat in certain places, then why don't you hear about it? Why isn't this common knowledge? Because this story is inconvenient for multiple reasons. First, control of narrative. History isn't just about what happened. It's about what gets remembered, and more importantly, what gets repeated. The version most people learn is simple. The Klan equals power. Black communities equals victims. And while that reflects part of the truth, is not the whole truth, but the full story is harder to package, harder to simplify. Because once you include resistance, you introduce complexity, you introduce agency, you introduce something that challenges the idea of complete powerlessness. And that doesn't fit neatly into a lot of historical frameworks. Now, think about this. If people grow up only seeing one side, only seeing domination without resistance, what does that do? It shapes perception. It reinforces a certain way of thinking about power, about history, about identity. And once that perception is set, it's hard to change. That's one reason, but there's another. And it's just as important, control. Because stories of effective resistance don't just stay in the past, they influence the present. If people understand that organized, disciplined resistance can shift power, that idea doesn't stay historical. It becomes relevant. It becomes something people can apply. And that makes certain institutions uncomfortable because it changes how people think about authority, about protection, about who is responsible for safety. Now let's go deeper. This isn't just about what was left out. It's about what was emphasized. You've seen the images, peaceful protesters, violence being done to them, dogs, hoses, brutality. And those images matter. They should be seen. They're real, but they're not the entire picture. Because while those moments were happening, there were also men standing just out of frame, watching, guarding, ready. And those men rarely make it into the story. Why? Because they complicate the message. They blur the line between passive and active resistance. They challenge the idea that change only came through one approach. And once you start acknowledging that, you have to rethink everything. Now, here's the key point. This isn't about replacing one narrative with another. It's about expanding it. Because the truth isn't one-dimensional. It never is. Real history has layers, contradictions, different strategies happening at the same time, all contributing in different ways. And this is one of those layers, one that's been underrepresented, not because it didn't exist, but because it wasn't highlighted. Now let's bring it back to something more personal, because this isn't just history. This is mindset. If you grow up only seeing images of suffering without seeing examples of resistance, what does that do to how you see yourself, to how you see your options, to how you understand power? It limits it. It narrows it. It creates a sense that certain outcomes are inevitable, that certain systems can't be challenged, that certain dynamics are fixed. But when you add in stories like this, that changes, because now there's evidence of something else. Evidence that even in the most controlled environments, there were cracks and people found them, used them, expanded them. That's powerful because it shifts perspective, and perspective drives behavior. Now, here's where it connects to today, because this isn't just about the Klan. It's about understanding how power operates, how fear is used, how control is maintained, and what happens when people disrupt that. Those patterns don't disappear. They evolve, they change form, but the fundamentals stay the same. Fear, control, perception, and resistance. Understanding that gives you a different lens, a sharper one that sees beyond surface level narratives. Now think about the men we've been talking about. They weren't famous. Most of their names aren't widely known. They weren't looking for recognition. They were focused on something else: protection, survival, dignity. And in doing that, they changed outcomes, not everywhere, not all the time, but enough to matter, enough to leave a mark. And that mark is still there, even if it's not widely discussed. Now, here's the question you should be asking. What other parts of history look different once you start looking for what was left out? Because this isn't isolated. This happens everywhere. Certain stories get amplified. Others get minimized. Not always intentionally, but consistently. And once you recognize that pattern, you start approaching information differently, more critically, more carefully, more aware of what might be missing. And that awareness, that's valuable because it puts you in a position to see things more clearly, to understand complexity, to avoid oversimplified narratives, and to recognize that history isn't just about what happened. It's about how it's told and who's telling it. Now bring it all together. The Klan wasn't always in control. Black communities weren't always passive. There were moments of resistance, moments of pushback, moments where fear shifted. And those moments matter because they change the story from one of pure domination to one that includes agency, strength, strategy, and impact. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. Let's stop talking about the Klan for a second, because this story isn't really about them. It's about what those men were protecting. And once you understand that, everything hits differently. These weren't just random confrontations. This wasn't just standing up for the sake of pride. This was about survival, real, everyday survival, being able to sleep at night, being able to leave your house without wondering if someone was watching, being able to exist without constant pressure. That's what was on the line. And when you look at it like that, the decisions they made start to make sense. Because when the system doesn't protect you, you have two options: accept it or build something that does. And they chose the second, not perfectly, not safely, but deliberately. Now think about what that actually requires. Not just courage, consistency, discipline, trust. Because this wasn't one person. This was groups of men coordinating, communicating, relying on each other, knowing that if something happened, they had to respond. No hesitation, no confusion. That level of organization doesn't happen by accident. It's built over time, through shared understanding, through shared risk, because everybody involved knew what they were stepping into. They knew the consequences, and they still showed up night after night. That's not something you can fake. Now, here's something even more important. They weren't just protecting themselves. They were protecting everyone around them: families, neighbors, entire communities, people who weren't armed, people who weren't trained, people who just wanted to live their lives. That responsibility changes everything, because now it's not just about you. It's about everybody depending on you. And when that's the case, you move differently, you think differently, you take things seriously. And that's exactly what they did. Now let's bring it into focus. Imagine knowing that at any moment, someone could show up armed, organized, ready to cause harm. And the only thing standing between that and your community is you. No backup, no guarantee. Just you and the people around you. That's the reality they lived in. And instead of running from it, they stepped into it. That's what makes this story powerful. Not just the confrontations, the commitment. Because it wasn't one moment. It was ongoing, sustained, day after day, night after night. Now here's where it gets deeper, because this wasn't just physical. It was psychological. They weren't just defending space. They were reclaiming it, taking back control over areas where fear had dominated. And once you reclaim space, you reclaim something else: confidence, the ability to move without hesitation, the ability to exist without constant tension. That's what they were really fighting for. And once that starts to come back, it spreads, because confidence is contagious, just like fear. Now imagine being in a community where, for the first time, you see people standing firm. You see people refusing to back down. You see people holding their ground. What does that do to you? It changes your perception. It changes what you believe is possible. And that belief spreads from person to person, family to family, community to community. That's how shifts happen, not all at once, but gradually, until something that once felt impossible starts to feel real. Now here's the part that matters most. These men didn't have the luxury of perfect choices. There was no safe option, no guaranteed outcome. Every decision carried risk, but they made those decisions anyway, because doing nothing was also a risk. And in many cases, a bigger one. That's the reality people don't always understand. Sometimes the choice isn't between safe and dangerous. It's between dangerous and more dangerous. And in that situation, you choose the path that gives you some control, some chance, some ability to influence what happens next. That's what they did. Now zoom out one more time, because this isn't just about one group or one moment or one era. This is about a pattern. People recognizing that systems aren't always going to protect them, and deciding to act anyway. That pattern shows up throughout history in different places, different forms, but the core idea stays the same. You don't wait for safety, you create it. And that's exactly what these men were doing. Not waiting, not hoping, creating, building something in real time, under pressure, with real consequences. That's what makes this story worth telling. Because it shows something real, something grounded, something that doesn't rely on ideal conditions, just decision, action, and follow through. Now, here's the final thought before we bring this home. If you remove these men from the story, if you erase what they did, what's left? A narrative where fear goes unchallenged, where power remains one-sided, where resistance is invisible. But once you add them back in, everything changes. The story becomes fuller, more accurate, more real. Because now it includes the people who didn't just endure history. They shaped it quietly, deliberately, and with impact. Let's end this clearly. The Ku Klux Klan was never untouchable. That's the part you were never supposed to fully understand. They were feared. They were violent. They caused real damage, but they were not invincible. And the moment people realized that, everything started to change. Because fear only works when it's one-sided. When one group believes they have complete control and the other believes they have none. That's the equation. That's what the Klan depended on. But in certain places, that equation broke. Not because someone gave permission. Not because the system suddenly worked. Because people made a decision. We're not doing this anymore. And then they backed that decision up with action, with organization, with discipline, and most importantly, with consistency. That's what broke the illusion. Not one moment, not one confrontation, repeated resistance over time, forcing a group built on intimidation to hesitate, to recalculate, to pull back. Now think about how powerful that is, because it means something fundamental. Power isn't always fixed, even when it looks like it is, even when everything around you says it is, even when history presents it that way. It can be challenged, disrupted, shifted, but only when people are willing to do something about it. That's the part that matters. Now let's be real for a second. This doesn't erase anything. It doesn't undo the violence, the fear, the loss. None of that disappears. But this adds something that changes the entire perspective, because it shows that even in the worst conditions, there were people who refused to accept the role they were being given. They refused to just endure. They chose to act. And that action had impact. Not everywhere, not perfectly, but enough to matter, enough to leave a mark. And that mark is still there, even if it's not widely talked about. Now, here's where this becomes more than just history, because once you understand this, you start to see patterns. You start to recognize how power actually works, how it's maintained, how it's challenged, and how perception plays a role in all of it. Because the Klan didn't just rely on violence, they relied on belief. The belief that they controlled everything. And once that belief was shaken, their power weakened. That's a lesson that goes beyond one group. It applies anywhere fear is used as a tool. Anywhere control depends on people believing they have no options. Once that belief changes, everything else can follow. Now bring it back to the men we've been talking about. No statues, no major recognition, no widespread acknowledgement, but real impact, real consequences, real change in specific places. They didn't wait to be protected. They became the protection. They didn't wait for permission. They acted, and in doing that, they altered the outcome. That matters because it shows something simple but powerful. History isn't just shaped by the people you hear about. It's also shaped by the people you don't, the ones operating in the background, the ones making decisions that don't make headlines, but change what happens next. That's who these men were. And that's why this story matters, because it fills in a gap. It adds context. It challenges assumptions. And once those assumptions are challenged, you start asking better questions. Now, here's the question I want you to sit with. What else have you been told as a complete story that's actually missing pieces? Because this isn't isolated. This happens all the time. Certain parts get highlighted, others get left out. And unless you go looking, you never see the full picture. But once you do, you can't unsee it. And that's where understanding starts. Not just accepting what's presented, but digging deeper, looking for what's missing, questioning what feels incomplete, because history is rarely as simple as it's presented. And this is one of those examples. Now let's bring it back to where we started. That moment, men in robes riding into a town, expecting fear, expecting control, expecting submission, and instead, they found resistance, organized, prepared, unafraid, and they turned around. That moment matters because it represents something bigger, a shift, a break in the pattern, proof that the outcome wasn't always predetermined, that there were cracks, and people found them, used them, expanded them. That's the real story. Not just what happened, but what changed when people decided to push back. So now I'll ask you directly, before this video, did you know this part of the story? Did you know there were places where the Klan backed down, where black men stood their ground and forced that outcome? Because for most people, the answer is no. And that's exactly why this matters. If this opened your perspective, if this made you rethink something, then don't let it stop here. Hit subscribe, drop a comment. Tell me what stood out to you, because the more these stories get told, the harder it is for them to stay hidden and the clearer the full picture becomes. I'll see you in the next one.